the program, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues, Mason and Marisa, to introduce you, Ivan. I'm Irini Tsakhreli. I'm a practicing architect and an educator, and I've been involved with T-Space's Architecture Residency program since 2017. I'm currently directing the program with the great help of Madeleine Hamilton, who is our host for this year's residency. And we have on our panel our great residents from all different parts of the world joining us, and they are the moderators for this conversation. The residency program is one of the different events and programs that we run here at T-Space, and it runs every July for 25 days intensive. And the theme for this residency is correlations. And the residents are kind of halfway through now producing their work and thinking along these ideas. And I think that the lecture today from you will hopefully help inspire further ideas. And so I'm very much looking forward to your talk. And with that, I will keep it very brief. I do want to make a mention about the supporters, because this residency program is free of charge for the participants. And in addition, we are able to provide scholarships to all and a travel stipend to visit us here in Rhinebeck, New York. So I do hope that even we can all meet together at the grounds of T-Space, because you're in the region as well, right?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I'm just across the river.
Exactly. Yeah. So I would be looking forward to that moment. And with that, I will pass it on to either Matt, if you like to say a few words, or Mason to introduce Ivan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Irene. Yes, I'll just a little bit about the format for today. So we will hear from Evan Calder-Williams for 35 to 40 minutes presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A moderated by our panelists, but anybody in the audience is also welcome to submit questions for the lecturer in the chat or with the Q&A function. And yeah, Marissa, I don't know if you would like to say a few words.
It was Marisa who he's really the
Yeah,
connection with Evan, right? Who introduced you to us. So Marisa, if you'd like to say a few words.
definitely. So thanks so much for joining us, Evan. You know, you were my teacher at Bard. And to our audience, I guess I just want to say how, you know, it really can't be understated the expansiveness of your work and your thinking, you know, not just in terms of your really like encyclopedic recall of references throughout history, theory, writing, art, film, architecture, technology. But I guess also your commitment to take seriously, you know, the detail, the fragment, the shard. Of course, I'm reminded of the inspiration of your seminar, Counterplans, which was the 1960s Italian publication Contropiano, and their mission, which was published in the second issue and can be summarized in the belief basically that no detail is too small or insignificant. And it's fun. I was looking back at my notes from the seminar and I took down this note, and I think this kind of starts to get at your thinking, or the way that you opened up my thinking, which is, quote, thresholds of visibility where things go from marvels to backgrounds, and the increasingly less visible technologies that enable this, unquote. You know, may that be infrastructure, extraction, energy, labor, the conditions of seeing and the conditions that make certain things fall, I guess, within a certain spectrum of visibility, how these must be interrogated. And Evan, your practice of doing this through teaching, writing, filmmaking, curating, it's really evident. And I'm really happy that the residents will be able to hear from you directly for our audiences, and then we'll have a great discussion.
Amazing. Yeah, thanks for the intro, and nice to virtually meet those of you. Sounds like, yeah, when you're here in August, I'm close enough to the area that maybe we can all meet in person. Yeah, I might have to get that phrase again later from you, Marissa, because I feel like that was off the cuff, and I was like, oh, that actually does sum up decently some of what I think I'm interested in, and particularly what I'll talk a bit about today. I'll note that, when I was first approached about doing this, I was told the theme was more kind of music and ecology, and I was like, okay, I can work with that. But the sort of actual conceptual banner, that is more gathered under now around this question of kind of correlation or sort of correlation. I was thinking in part about what happens with that different pronunciation. I'm glad to hear that because I actually think it's an incredibly important idea for thinking historically. I think often it gets put more now, and I think even the brief I was shown with the kind of passage from Kiesler, et cetera, puts it in a framework maybe familiar from contemporary work on ecology and sort of more than human networks, et cetera. And I think that's obviously of value, but I think there's a different way where this problem of correlation or correlation opens on something quite different, which is specifically about the way in which historical transformations, I think especially including of the built world and its structures and infrastructures, and indeed what Marissa noted, the sense of, not only phenomena on the edge of visibility, but structures, mechanisms, sort of techniques that hover on the edge of noticeability, the way in which those get registered, right? The way in which these things do or do not get noticed, and the way in which the kind of capacity to even register them, especially in real time, itself is changing. So what I want to kind of think with or pose the idea of today is that I think this question of correlation gains a really specific conceptual force when it's negated or when it's brought into negativity. And that's to say, when we start to think about the problem of what gets discorrelated or sort of discorrelation. And by that, I mean sort of two distinct things. I'll try to sort of touch on them both. On the one hand, I mean that prospect or that sort of effort of an apparent non-relation over which we're really desperately trying to assert a relation or kind of project that there is, in fact, a kind of link there. I feel like now conspiracy theory does a lot of that work in ways, and we could talk maybe about how that the sort of paranoid imaginary of that takes over. But on the one hand, the sense of a kind of non-relation that we kind of seek pattern within. And on the other hand, and maybe more importantly for this question of noticeability or visibility that Marissa was alluding to, I think is the sense of the fraying of connections or relations that were present and the way in which one tries to kind of register or think with or pick up on what happens when those are becoming sort of unbound in real time around us, right? What are the kind of mechanisms used for that? This is hugely abstract, which is not where I want to remain. So I want to kind of set a couple terms before getting more specifically into how I think this plays out in terms of environmental justice movements, into kind of questions around infrastructure noticeability, et cetera. I don't know what you've been talking about in terms of kind of correlation and correlation. I assume you've done enough that I'm not going to do some awful basic what is correlation mode. But I will note that, based on the brief that Maddie sent me, and I was alluding to, I want to kind of follow a slightly different track. And even before we get into the question of kind of the discorrelate or the discorrelated, because with co-realism itself, in Kiesler's sense, right, and you have that kind of key passage from there, that's a kind of sense or a claim or an assertion of real dynamics of interconnection, right? You can say that it kind of makes an ontological claim. It's making a claim about the real relatedness of things, right? A sort of structure of being that is constituted around those relations. And it's also an ethical one, somewhat implicitly, somewhat explicitly, like what can therefore be done architecturally or in the world to work in accordance with that, right? So instead, though, rather than sort of co-realism or correalism, depending how you want to pronounce it, I want to hold to that sense of that word correlation, because I think you start to get a different sense. And that's the sense of a kind of pronouncement of a kind of connection or mutual relation. It's one that, at least I feel like for me, but I don't think I'm alone in this, we often use when we can't be sure of the exact mechanism or structure that constitutes a connection, right? There's the sense of kind of sets of observable phenomena in discrete things, discrete spheres, like the flight, the way in which birds are migrating at a certain time of year versus the speed at which cars are driving. Again, this can tip over into a sort of, at times, paranoid or conspiratorial or poetic, depending how you want to define something like this. In Lacan's sense, actually, this noticing is at the heart of psychosis as well. But you would say that in some sense, correlation gets used to kind of make the suggestion that there is a kind of tracking or parallel between discrete phenomena without being able to necessarily say why or how these relate, right? So much more simply, I hope that makes sense, but like as the common phrase goes, people repeat all the time, correlation is not causation, right? And that's to say you can identify a correlation between things, and that can be the start of discovering a kind of structure of relation, a genuine set of kind of techniques or embodied technical forms that bring about a certain set of repeatable patterns or effects across registers. But it's also just that. Correlation just names a kind of a start, a judgment, a kind of noticing of a pattern. From there, I think, begins the effort to locate what might lie below that. I'm reminded here in a sort of different register of something that C.L.R. James, the remarkable radical historian, writes in the introduction to the Black Jacobins, his history of the Haitian Revolution. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's not a beach read per se, but read it. It's extremely worth your time. And James makes this point in the intro when he writes, quote, "In a revolution, when the ceaseless, slow accumulation of centuries bursts into volcanic eruption, the meteoric flares and flights above are a meaningless chaos and lend themselves to infinite caprice and romanticism, unless the observer sees them always as projections of the subsoil from which they came." End of quote. So that's to say that the noticing of a correlation might remain or stay at the level of flares and chaos, of caprice and projection, or again, increasingly of a certain kind of conspiracy of taking utterly unconnected events and asserting false links between them. The names of furniture in a Wayfair catalog, for instance, and political events in the US, right? That said, I'll just note, this is a sort of sidebar, but because we're in the context also, I know of architectural practice and sort of spatial theory and questions, I'm also really wary of or want to kind of put a pin in or a crack in some of the fundamental metaphors that get used to talk about this. Like consider, for instance, in this James example, that not only uses the really consistent, sort of strikingly consistent figure of the volcano as this index of political or anti-political energy and release, it also, though, has this model of subterranean foundation and epiphenomena above, right? I think there's a certain fantasy or an epistemic fantasy of like getting down to real things. I think it belongs not entirely, but partially to a kind of base and superstructure model of thinking, which I think held sway for too long and how people wanted to think about the relation between, let's say, economic and social relations, and then on the other hand, cultural, political forms, et cetera. So just to note that there's, even as we go into this, I think there's a kind of question always about what are the fantasies of knowledge that underwrite both these claims, but also the claim of like getting down to the real thing. Okay, so already, even with the idea of correlation itself, like I'm saying, there's a doubt. There's a certain kind of shadow. And that's the doubt that what we keep noticing and taking as related may in fact bear no real relation, or that we simply can't be sure because you remain stuck at the level of the correlation itself, unable to see what moves beneath it or what generates the phenomena that seem to track. What I'm slightly alluding to here, or want to note a certain echo of, is how the idea of correlationism got posed in philosophy. This may be familiar to some of you, may not be to others. In the early 2000s, Quentin Meillassoux, a French philosopher, poses a critique many places, but especially in this book called After Finitude. This critique becomes a substantial element of what got gathered under the name of speculative realism, which, let's say, participates with a number of other tendencies and led to things that got very trendy in arts and humanities and architecture discourse, et cetera, around kind of object-oriented ontology, et cetera, right? In After Finitude, this book, which again, depending on your taste, is either fascinating or extremely arcane and boring, so whatever reader be advised. But he identifies and tries to critique or undermine the idea of correlation itself. And he suggests that kind of correlation names, quote, the idea, or excuse me, correlationism, I should say, names, quote, the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other, end quote. I don't want to go down the full thorny road of this because, again, despite the fact that it proved influential for some people, it's an argument that's very internal to philosophy as a discipline and to rereadings of Immanuel Kant, etc. I'm very wary of like the especially contemporary art world magpie version where it'll take up an incredibly complicated internal argument and then isolate a single term and be like, that's what we're doing now. So I don't want to go into that fully, but what I do want to take out of this or note is I think what I'm trying to pose is also grappling with this problem. And I also think a kind of political and social problem of gaps and unknowns, and of the stakes of being potentially stuck with what seems similar or related simply because there seems to be an echo in behavior or effect across time, that we can kind of overlay discrete things across that shared passage of time. So without recourse to philosophy here, I think we get closer to this already with what I raised, that skeptics' admonition that correlation is not causation. But to move into this, from this into what I want to identify as discorrelation is really to move away from philosophy or from ontology or epistemology and instead into historical questions, into ones that take particular shape at junctures of human experience, of spaces, of ecological patterns, of technical objects and systems, and above all, ones that get navigated and lived in the most basic of ways, right? In terms of what comes to feel off and of what perhaps can't be proven or constitutively cannot be proven. So this is what I want to kind of focus on through the rest of this a little bit, this kind of problem of straining for correlations or feeling a genuine kind of pulling apart or discorrelating. I think one of the most crucial places to think this, to put it in really practical terms, is the question of climate change and climate chaos, right? You can see this perhaps most obviously when it comes to extreme weather and the effects of sort of human-produced climate change, in which the stakes of how to assert a correlation between, right, like centuries of carbon energy regimes on the one hand, and on the other, the fact that it rains 4 inches in an hour the way it did not used to, the stakes of that become extremely high. Yeah. And I think the general tendency may be a little less so dominant. This could be interesting to talk about, I don't know if here or whatever, but like I think especially over the past kind of decade and a half or so, fading a little bit, the general tendency, of course, has been one that's not just quantitative, but average, right? Trying to urge individuals and states to take seriously these shifts by means of focusing not on the immediately observable, but on general shifts in climate, right? Like 2 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, et cetera. These kind of global aggregates of global warming as such. There's a disconnect internal to this, which is that even though one knows those links are extremely real, obviously, historically, even given that, the structure of connection and causation, let's say something like correlation naming the prospect of thinking within that, it's suffused by lags, by latencies, by delays, by sort of odd timescales. Take, for instance, this like endlessly repeated trope or figure of the tipping point, right? Like, or hitting the point of no return. That itself is an incoherent idea, in large part because, of course, like as one knows, you can already be past that and not know it until later. There's nothing that kind of rings the bell in, I don't know what, the House of Climate announces you've kind of hit that point. I wrote about this years ago, and my first book was a study of kind of apocalyptic thinking and culture, and I make this argument in there that the very promise of the kind of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic has been sort of unmade by the uneven geographies of capital and the kind of timescales, and that in fact, there's a lot of ideological weight invested in the fantasy of like, the point of visibility. Now we've hit this sort of point. I think that's kind of incoherent. And I think there's a way where you can see the real danger that produces in terms of also thinking about the frankly militant means that would be needed to alter something like climate policy, because there still is a kind of threshold of visibility rather than saying like, we might have blown past that point forever and we don't know exactly when that happens. So there's one kind of issue in that regard, right? Which is expecting that kind of snapping into place is pure fantasy. It's a kind of comforting fantasy. One that I think also has a lot to do with the fact that so much of the 20th century's imaginaries of genuine doomsday, of a kind of apocalyptic scenario, became shaped by atomic technology, by the prospect of a kind of literal punctual point, like the moment happened, the bombs are dropped. That gets ported, I think, in really complicated ways to thinking about the slower turbulence of something like extreme weather and shifting climate. So there's one thing, which is like baked into that, there's a kind of problem of waiting for some sort of clean correlation that simply does not happen. The other thing, of course, is we can see now pretty plainly that general averages do not tend to animate humans towards action to anywhere close to a level that one might hope. I think it would be impossible to assert otherwise to this. That's not a failure of imagination. I have no interest in sort of blaming people for not being able to think abstractly or something. It obviously has much more to do with the absolute power, the entrenched and infrastructural power of those who profit from and reinforce those systems. But nevertheless, I think this kind of double failure, you'd say, of correlation as animating, right? Either because it's kind of absent in the clarity you'd want, or because it turns out to not really actually be something that people are able to kind of organize around, raises, I think, a hard question, which is if that kind has not been as powerful as one might want it to be, where else then in the history of ecological justice or of radical critique or histories of kind of sabotage and politics from below can one look to that? And I think this is maybe the kind of key point I want to get to, which is I think the ground of that or of that turn would have to take really seriously the process, the experience of registering and noticing how things seem to come in and out of correlation. And that is set against the baseline, not just, or maybe not especially not just, of statistical averages, but a kind of continuity of lived experience or communal knowledge, the kind of deep sorts of knowing that come from living in the same place for a long time or working too closely with materials or processes or certain organisms. And that very basic form of being like, there should not be mosquitoes hatching in April, right? We live in the Hudson Valley, so frankly, I expect mosquitoes to hatch at all times of year. I should not be surprised by this. But just to say, like, for those of you who haven't been here yet, the residents, I apologize in advance, but August is nicer. But just to say, like, what I'm kind of getting at here is I think these things that are so easy abstractly to dismiss as something just like, oh, personal judgment or someone's kind of feelings or noticings. And I want to kind of argue that actually there's an enormous political stakes to taking seriously the kind of registration of basic rhythms, basic patterns, basic destabilizations, right, that are kind of happening around you. There's sort of two angles or fronts I'd want to maybe like unfold it on a little bit. I think on the one side, this might be something like a struggle to insist upon a correlation, the struggle to kind of insist that there is real kind of underlying cause here. And I have in mind here particularly fights from communities around the world to insist on toxicity, for instance, to insist that what you're seeing in terms of elevated rates of cancer, of fill in the blank of anything else you want here, is in fact caused, let's say, by industrial pollution. There's obviously lots of work on this. Something like Joan Martinez Aliyer's Environmentalism of the Poor is a kind of strong text in this. But think, for instance, of atomic weapons testing in the United States, right, where in some sense you have people all through the West and Southwest sort of insisting on what they are seeing. You had, for instance, the Western Shoshone and Paiute people registering the changes in rabbits and deer, noticing levels of mutations in birth, noticing literally different colors in the sky when sleeping outside in the summer, and then also, of course, noticing elevated rates of cancer and trying for decades and decades, essentially unsuccessfully, to insist that these are deeply related. They're not arbitrary things that happen to be happening at the same time. The color of the sky and the rabbits being stillborn are both the consequence of the weapons testing, of the atomic weapons testing that was being done in that area. So in that case, you basically have people being a kind of denial of any relation between these, right? A sort of state denial of that. And it took environmental advocates decades and decades to kind of forcefully try to insist that those links are real, right? We might also think of another famous case. These are all really bleak, so I won't belabor them, but I would say the denial of mercury poisoning in Japan, of quote unquote like Minamata disease, and the history of that is a very clear example of this. It's just Mel Chen's work on this is very good. You can see this book called Animacies, which writes really well about mercury poisoning and the forms of kind of co-determination that you can kind of see within this. So in these, and I think so many more instances that we could kind of trace out at length, the temporal and spatial logic of fallout and of toxicity, right? That fundamental lag, that delay, that dispersal, both in time and in space, kind of physically, makes it not only hard to detect exact causes, but infinitely harder to litigate and prove, right? No matter when the links are obvious to all in a lived way. So that's to say the stakes are extremely high in this. The stakes of, in fact, insisting on a genuine kind of set of links, a kind of network of harm in some regard, insisting that these are symptoms of the same hidden cause is something that has to historically be fought for, and with an extremely uphill battle against states, corporations, etc. That makes sense? Yeah. Okay. Conversely, and this is what I was alluding to before, I think there's also this question of kind of registering something like the opposite, registering a discorrelation or a kind of coming undone of what felt so given and stable that you almost don't have to notice it. And again, if Marissa, I think, was raising the centrality of my work of this question of these sort of thresholds of discernibility, I think in some regard here, one of the things we're talking about is, in a strange way, something that a lot of, I'd say, kind of relatively global modernist art practice took really seriously, this kind of training and animating of processes of kind of noticing, right? This work of defamiliarizing turns out to be something, though, that is also produced very kind of concretely by toxicity, by shifts in climate, by deforestation, etc. There's ways in which something you have never noticed in some sense because you haven't had to, because it's cyclical, because it's seasonal, because it's given, suddenly, depending on the speed of it, creeps or kind of roars into recognition. There's a sense that kind of something is off. And I'm holding to that kind of banal phrase because I want to kind of be honest, I think, about how we register something like this, which is often not a sort of clinical or critical judgment, but this sort of gut feeling of something being really wrong, of the ground being a little kind of uncertain beneath us. To be really clear on this, I don't by any means want to like oppose this fundamentally to actual kind of technical forms of measurement and quantification. I have no interest in kind of rejecting those somehow as fundamentally unable to track something like this. I see instead we should think of these as like extended forms of sensation and registration. The question is what use they are put to. But just to be really clear, because I'm going to talk about things that I feel like casually would be in the realm of vibes, I want to be very clear that I have no interest in dismissing like the work it actually takes to, for instance, track hurricanes or to try to notice levels of lead in soil, etc. Right? But I think what we have to add to those, or maybe push more to reinforce, are the kind of ways of taking seriously that other kind of noticing I mentioned, right? The ones when a kind of stabilized presence or relations come undone. I want to give here an example or a kind of reading of an example that's kind of relatively famous in certain contexts. That's an essay by Pier Paolo Pasolini, the Italian director, polymath, radical, one of the century's great jack of all trades, so to speak. This 1975 essay that was originally called Il vuoto del potere, the void of power, or what I'd want to translate as like power's hollow. It came to be known later as just the article on the fireflies, l'articolo delle lucciole, just like the article on the fireflies. And what often gets remembered from it in some regard is the kind of central figure of the essay, that it kind of, right near the kind of beginning of it, which I'll kind of quote from that. And then I want to sort of extrapolate what I think is at stake in this. So Pasolini writes, quote, in the first years of the 60s, 1960s, I should be clear, because of the pollution of the air and more generally of the countryside, and because of the pollution of the water, those azure rivers and crystal clear canals, the fireflies started to disappear. The phenomena was lightning quick, and the word he uses here is fulmineo, which I can kind of return to, and dazzling. After a few years, there weren't any more fireflies. And then in parentheses, they are now a wholly heartbreaking memory of the past, and an old man who could have such a memory can no longer recognize his youth in the new youths, and therefore can no longer even have a beautiful morning, M-O-U-R-N, morning, like a morning for, not morning after night, of that time, end quote. So this description comes to sort of haunt the whole text, and indeed kind of tends to be the element most remembered of this essay, this kind of noting of this quite, indeed startling figure of the disappearance of the fireflies. And it animates that text not only because it articulates a sense of that sudden wrenching passage from a kind of flickering but almost ignorable presence that, like, you notice the fireflies, but you also don't because they're there all the time, into a kind of irrecoverable past towards which no new connections can be built, right? It does articulate this kind of wrenching, and for him, kind of heart-wrenching version of that. I'll note also that there's a kind of remarkable, perversely tragic compression that the essay does on a kind of linguistic level itself. The vanishing of the fireflies, the quote-unquote, those lightning bugs, gets experienced from the outside in this kind of moment of noticing as if it's in a flash of lightning. Fulmine is the term he's using here. And as if like one of the pulses of this exceeded the frame of the organism and its total, immense, devastating, this kind of shock that just erases them in a go. So this is obviously deeply mournful. It's openly nostalgic. It doesn't hide that whatsoever. And it can be and often is used as a kind of easy shorthand for a certain kind of devastation. Like, we had fireflies, now they are gone. This is what humans do to the world, which is not untrue, right? What goes missing in that, though, and the reason I'm raising this, is what actually happens elsewhere in the essays, and the reason that this kind of trope of the fireflies appear, albeit appear in their disappearance. And that's not to make a claim about ecological consequences of heavy industrialization. It's instead to note a kind of crisis in the ability to notice in the first place. This is really what's kind of at stake here. The fireflies appear as this figure for thinking, how is it to miss something so profound that you only notice it when it's gone, right? In this, the kind of thing that goes missing, the thing that we kind of keep missing, he relentlessly refers to it as just qualcosa, just something in Italian. This he calls it this kind of enormous something that has happened, and that can be kind of registered for him in terms of, strangely, electoral politics and the languages of that. This would get into the minutiae, but just for those interested, it's specifically about the kind of post-fascist, post-World War II Christian Democratic Party and what he sees in this debate about the emergence of a new fascism. But essentially, the kind of something, this enormous qualcosa that he's getting at, is essentially capitalism. It's the surging of kind of monopoly and heavily industrializing capital into Italy, especially in the post-war years. What the kind of people at the time they referred to as just, slightly cute for a terrible process. The boom, just il boom is kind of nice, right? So for him, the key point within this is to try to account for the ways in which, even as the effects produced by this shift, and those are effects that are anthropological, their effects in media, their effects in kind of urbanism and how the city is organized, in what is built, what is not built. Even as these kind of pile up, it could not be grasped at the time it happened, right? That's to say, it's about the problem of correlation or a crisis of it, and this problem of noticing in real time or not, or trying to see how effects in discrete spheres align. So this is why the fireflies are there. They come in under this as this kind of figure with which to think about how it is to not notice until it's too late. But crucially, and I can't really stress this enough, they also can't be reduced to a metaphor. And I think this is where things get a lot more interesting and sort of complicated in this, which is that they are a figure of thought, indeed, the fireflies here, but we're also talking about real links and kind of real consequences, real historical kind of simultaneities. That's to say, in this, the temporal torsion you get of this kind of strange problem of kind of trying to notice in real time, always being too late, predicting too early, being called you're crazy, etc. All the stakes of this in some regard, they're not just limited to that melancholic feeling of the kind of old man, quote unquote, who has his memories jolted by this kind of ripple effect of industrial pollution, right? This kind of ecological aftermath of the past keeps bringing about a present in which the archaic ancient experience of watching fireflies come to an end. That already has, I think, a sort of horrifying density of kind of time torqued into that. But I think there's also a more specific element in operation that is kind of minor but ultimately crucial. And that's a kind of parallelism or potential parallelism between, as he mentions, this kind of qualcosa that really was felt a decade ago, and then the disappearance. And given the essay's publication in 1975, and when he notes something happened a decade ago, and then the other in the first years, the 60s, he's essentially talking about the same moment. So that's to say that, quite simply, whatever the link, that's to say, this seeming correlation, without knowing exactly how this might be related in some regard, the vanishing fireflies and the effects of this enormous qualcosa, this enormous surging of the relations of capital, they occur in the same world and at the same time. So if they're joined in his essay, kind of on the page and in thought, it's done so to try to form a bridge between these two simultaneous and actual phenomena, albeit of different scale and consequence. And both of them can't be reduced to a rhetorical figure. So that's to say here, the bond that's at stake in this crisis of correlation, the attempt to kind of argue for it, the kind of mourning of maybe a loss of the ability to do so, that bond is not analogical, it's not metaphorical, it's not just one of simultaneity. I'm going to put a tiny, I always wish there was a way I don't know what the spatial metaphor would be. I want to open like a Doctor Strange time pocket for something to come back to, just to note that I think this question of analogy, maybe particularly to how that term has been used within architectural history and discourse, I think is really kind of some relevance here. I'd note something like Aldo Rossi's scientific autobiography, where he ends up asserting a certain kind of analogical process of thinking that lets you chain across time through a kind of encounter with certain architectural forms. In any case, something we can talk about. I just want to note that before it vanishes. So what I was saying here, the bond between this process of rapid capitalization and the disappearing of the fireflies is neither just analogical or metaphorical or simultaneous. It's historical, and it's shot through with that tangle of cause and effect. Because at its core, the very conditions that produce the disappearance, which is the devastation of the milieu of the fireflies, the environment in which they live, and the conditions that are relevant for their persistence in there. The encroaching reign of what Amadeo Bordiga called that forest of bayonets and chimneys, which I gathered as a title for this and I can return to. And what Pasolini really bluntly just talks about here is the poisoning of soil, countryside, and water. These are, of course, nothing other than the accelerated ecological symptoms of that rapid industrialization, right? In other words, they are themselves the side effects of the very something that they might bring closer to the edge of thought. The disappearance of the fireflies is produced by the thing that disappearance might let you start to kind of think here. So in this essay, though, the major challenge and why I think it's so important is because it's really ultimately in a quite sort of tragic register about the loss of the ability to do that noticing, this kind of asymptotic ability to notice that kind of keeps failing to a certain regard, even though it must be fought for. They're up against what he gets at in this essay, and that I, in my own work, refer to really simply as the problem of kind of saturation. And that's to sort of say this particular problem, both of a kind of slow timescale of the absorption, and whether we mean literally in terms of like chemicals into bodies, human and otherwise, but also, let's say, of technical transformations where they happen so slowly that you're kind of rewired in real time without ever getting, again, that like tipping point, that moment of like, now we are prosthetically remolded or something. There's a sense of saturation as that like absorption, you can no longer draw a divide between what is you and what you would like to think is not you. But the other side of it that I think is equally crucial is that it also would name a kind of overwhelming of the ability to notice further, to take in more, to be at some point when something is saturated, things can get worse and it's unable to kind of pick up that there is more. And I'm drawing here in the work a really interesting thinker named Rahul Mukherjee, and he did work much more like anthropological, talking about the saturation of bodies and of air by wireless signals, like cell phone signals and other wireless signals in India. And Mukherjee makes, again, this kind of crucial point in which the problem of kind of saturation here as well would be that you lose an ability to register more at some point. It kind of, the very sense, the kind of metrics by which you would identify a worsening or an increase or something like that gets overwhelmed by those same processes. And so, put more in my terms, away from his specific kind of anthropological account, what we're talking about is a kind of crisis in which the very thing that might allow you to pick up on this itself gets kind of transformed and remade in the process. I'll add a kind of few notes, and then we can kind of wrap up quickly, and then we can sort of go to conversation. I think there's a few ways that something like this would point out towards sort of historically. One I think is what sometimes people talked about, the problem of second nature or third nature, these kind of scramblings of basic kind of parameters by which one would try to organize a relation between the seemingly the wild or the kind of less human mediated space and then something like the technical and the built. Amadeo Bordiga was a sort of earlier contemporary of Pasolini in Italy, a fascinating, incredibly idiosyncratic thinker. And he has this phrase in 1949 where he says, quote, "The place of the worst barbarism is that modern forest that makes use of us, this forest of chimneys and bayonets, of machines and weapons, of strange inanimate beasts that feed on human flesh," end quote. It's obviously a very melodramatic passage, so is a lot of his writing, probably partially why I like it. But one of the things that's kind of key as well here is, again, we're not simply telling a story of something like devastation, clear-cutting, removal, etc., but a scrambling of the kind of categories in this. For him, the forest at some point becomes overtaken, not simply by then the clearing, but a kind of modern forest, right? It becomes kind of displaced and loses its moorings. I think there's another sort of set of interesting cues we can take. There's one, it's a sort of longish passage that I can actually, do we have a moment? Are we okay on time, Marissa?
Maddie, how are we doing?
Yeah, we're good.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, it's a really, I think, remarkable passage that's been important to me. So I kind of want to share it with people, in part to guide to this book. It appears in Philippe Descola's book Beyond Nature and Culture, which is this like big sort of synthetic attempt to kind of give an anthropological account of what he sees as the ultimate rarity, and not in a good way. This is this sort of idiosyncrasy of the most basic flat divide between nature and culture, around which so much of the history of sort of Western thought, particularly Western imperial thought, hinged. And in this book, he's really at pains to suggest just how sort of we should see this as a minor position, not a major one. But he makes this, gives this reading of a set of terms in Japanese that I've found hugely generative for thinking about these kind of flips that Bordiga is talking about. So quoting from Descola, quote, "Japanese establishes an opposition between Seto, or the inhabited place, and Yama, the mountain, which is perceived not so much as a relief elevation that contrasts with the plain, but rather as the archetype of an uninhabited space, comparable to the original meaning of the French or English desert." Continuing from Descola, "A Japanese mountain is neither a space to conquer, nor the seat of a disturbing otherness. So it's not really perceived as wild, although it may paradoxically become so when its vegetation is totally domesticated. In many regions of the archipelago, the forests growing on primeval slopes were replaced following World War II by industrial plantations of native conifers, mainly Japanese cypresses and sugi cedars. For the inhabitants of the mountain villages, the old forest with its deciduous or glossy-leaved species had been a place where harmony and beauty were enhanced by the presence of deities, as well as a store of resources that were of use to the domestic economy. However, the plantations of resinous trees that replaced it evoke nothing but disorder, sadness, and disorganization. Badly cared for, taking over fields and clearings, and having lost much of their economic value, these black trees, growing monotonous serried ranks, are now beyond the social and technical control of those who planted them, which I think is really kind of the key point here. The mountain is Yama, the forest is Yama, uninhabited places are Yama. The same term is used in all three cases. But although it is wholly domesticated, this artificial mountain forest has become a moral and economic desert. In short, it is much more wild than the natural forest it replaced. End quote. I think for me, it's a really kind of remarkable passage that I think lets us kind of think with what I'm trying to get at via Pasolini and these other examples around this problem of saturation, in that we're not talking, or I'm not at least talking about any sort of static nature that then is sort of encroached upon, nor am I talking a kind of trans-historical, stable human thought that's just tracking such depredations. Instead, what I want to get at and hope to kind of offer to the conversations and work you've been doing is to really think about the kind of historicity, the historical particularity of the kind of doubts and turbulence registered by correlations and discorrelations, by processes of kind of bindings and unbindings, and the ways in which even the kind of mechanisms, sensibilities, kind of tools for noticing we have are themselves kind of being shifted as well and have to struggle to gain purchase. In the example, for instance, of Pasolini's essay, right, those same actual physical, spatial, architectural, literally lighting factors, the same street lights that cause, in some sense, the fireflies to move in and out of certain areas, the things that lead to them, they also are factors working on us too, not metaphorically, but very physically, right? Those same Christian Democrats that he sees as unable to recognize the sort of fascism of which they became stewards, ate grain touched with those same poisons. Those who wanted to drive them out of power walked home through the same streets that forgot how to be dark and were lit by electricity alone. That's to say that we get no distance from this, and to recognize the subtle changes that get produced in our ability to understand and navigate a conjuncture, including these kind of dramatic changes when stepped back from a little bit. You have to strain against saturation, to hold on to these fleeting little moments of horror, of noticing, of, oh my God, this is wrong. This should not be here. This is no longer, etc. These most basic little affects. You have to hold on to them to build an interval, I think, in which that disappearance or that mutation kind of stutters or is kind of held for a moment. I think really simply enough, that's one of the things that can be fairly expected of something like art and literature and cinema, to be old-fashioned in their own ways, to think about how you produce that interval, to kind of think the suspicion we feel and kind of become alien to ourselves for a certain kind of moment. But in some regard, what this is sort of up against consistently is the fact that not only are the kind of ways in which we are registering this being constantly overwhelmed by new media forms, by new sets of conditions that kind of work upon us, but also, of course, ongoing production of new networks, of new stabilities, of new forms that try, in some sense, to reinforce certain kinds of correlations and relations at the expense of others in some regard here. So I'll leave it here so we can move to a discussion, but I wanted to kind of end with this point of starting to gesture towards the problem, not simply of something like a chaos that we struggle to detect, but also coming to reckon with indeed, as Marissa kind of alluded to, these almost infrastructural, even kind of sub-infrastructural patterns that in some sense make possible from the beginning certain kinds of inhuman relations and make others kind of impossible to see. So I'll hold off there and yeah, let's chat now.
Okay, yeah, our thank you so much, Evan. And everybody feel free to just unmute and engage, question, make a comment, and anybody who's not in the panel, feel free to write in the chat or the Q&A.
I'd love, Evan, if you could maybe talk a little bit about, because I had this running question throughout the talk, like, oh yeah, how do we kind of train or hang on to or recalibrate our ability to notice? And one of, your positive ending of, maybe it is through art or watching film or, new media forms that can help not lose that faculty, I guess. But I also want to think about, you just had this essay come out with Triple Canopy about self-sabotage and like the self-improvement industrial complex. And like, I feel like there's something going on where maybe culturally, societally, people are feeling the creep of like, they're noticing that they are losing their ability to notice and how to fill that vacuum. And maybe it is through protocols for self-improvement, like logging off and touching grass and, all of this stuff. And it's like, how do those, I guess, how are those insufficient? Or maybe they can be, because there are ones with good intentions to help us get to the place of hanging on to that faculty for noticing. Because I think art, but also like the self-help, self-improvement, they're both possible ways to kind of fill that gap.
It's a great question. I'm gonna want to say like 3 words, and then I'll try to like loop back to all of them, just because I feel like otherwise I should have been writing, forgetting them. But like, or I guess the thing, make sure I want to come back to this question a little bit of something that's kind of collective or trans individual, because I think this is key. And I also want to kind of hit on the question of, I think, resisting an idea that this kind of notice, which you're not saying, I think you're correctly paraphrasing a position in which that kind of noticing means like lying on the grass with the ticks, right? I think there's a way in which there's a kind of nostalgic fetishization of the natural that actually can entirely like retrench this divide. So I want to come back to those things. First, I think, with regards to something, again, like art, and, you know me in this sort of context as well. And I think, again, it sort of sounds old-fashioned, but I genuinely believe that some of the ways that a lot of people have thought about what art does and what's kind of important about it, and ways that are pretty at odds with the general trend line of at least contemporary art as an arbiter of like human visual sonic culture, etc. That some of these ways of thinking about something that does political work, not because of its content, but because it works on the level of the human sensorium, that for me remains really powerful. I don't think somehow that was like, should be cast to the wolves would be a weird expression. I was gonna say the wolves of formalism. I wish there were wolves of formalism. I'd happily like join them. But no, I don't think that's something that somehow is like historically outmoded or sort of reactionary. I actually think that there's a real kind of question about what we think things like art and literature might be good at that we think other spheres of human activity aren't good at doing. And I think, this is one of the reasons, as someone who like cares deeply about art and film, etc., and also as an essayist, increasingly I'm sort of like, I'm not that interested in art trying to be an essay, because I don't think the existence of like saying X, this is my major, I feel like, cultural logic of the last 10 years, saying X is important does not mean Y is unimportant. It's simply a question of like also being like, what can this do that maybe other things can't? And I think that the work that I care about in artists' practices writ large, but including cinema, writing, music, etc.
Architecture.
What'd you say?
Architecture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Are ones that that take really seriously holding on to these moments of indecision or kind of noticing or messiness that are not necessarily trying to be clear or sort of PR-able in some way or didactic in some regard. And I say this again, like I have made some of the world's most didactic films. So this is maybe like I'm self-own here, but no, or maybe it's a shift in how I've really thought about this. Increasingly, I think that there's an important demand to be made for holding open a space where what we want to do is, keep chipping away at the forms of familiarity that make us sort of insensate to these little changes that I think are often kind of profound, to wade into the sort of whatever historical water of that. The person that some of what I'm saying is most historically associated with was Viktor Shklovsky, the kind of Russian formalist theorist, still really remarkable. This essay called Art and Technique. It has the idea of defamiliarization or estrangement. It gets taken often as a kind of like straw man of pure formalism, right? What people always forget when they don't read the essay, or they forget when they do read it, the examples he gives immediately, like right off the bat, about how art might like defamiliarize familiar perception is not, his one line was like, make the stone stony. Sure, there's a version of that that's kind of like, now I'm touching grass for real. The actual examples he gives are immediately about literary forms that allow us to see social cruelty and structures of power for what they actually are. And he gives this example of this kind of passage from Tolstoy of a kind of horse seeing the absurdity of human kind of social forms. So these examples of someone being like whipped in the street, and the examples he gives of literary technique, and I would say this is true of cinematic technique or other forms, it's not, again, some like, to talk about restoring sensation doesn't mean like we're just going to look at Rothko's or something like that. It's instead this question of like, what has become so naturalized, so given, so obdurate that we take it as immovable. And I think one then of the things that, again, all of these practices can kind of do is to make the ground unsteady, right? And to allow us to see some of these things maybe for what they are, which are like arcane, absurd, and unnecessary rituals of human cruelty, right? And denigration. So that would be one kind of answer of that. I think in terms of, yeah, the maybe we can, in the chat, we can give people the link to that triple canopy essay, just in case people want it at some
For
point.
sure.
With the question of, yeah, like wellness culture, my great enemy, and some of these other things. I would, I wonder, or I would want to insist, and this is what I get a little bit towards the end of that essay, that part of the problem with a lot of that is not obviously like people's attempts to feel decent in the world, etc. It's the degree to which it preserves the unit of the individual as like the sole thinkable space in which both like not only politics is supposed to happen, the fundamental unit of it, the individual citizen voter, etc., but also in some regard the one who must bear the weight and the pressure and the burden of these enormous kind of changes in some regard, the degree to which you are supposed to take it on. And yeah, like HR, not human rights, sort of human resources and management discourse, especially from the 70s on. You can see this via Peter Singer and others after that, etc. Like what's one of the things that's sort of, striking through all of that is, again, this dislocation under the sign of a humanization, of taking seriously people's creative capacities and being full, open thinkers and team members, except the famous team members, or the iconic example of the sandwich artist of Subway and things like that. That does a lot of bad things. One of the things it does, though, is it also kind of puts the onus of bearing these changes on one as a supposedly flexible being. And I've been writing a lot recently about paralysis, like the trope and figure of paralysis. You can find on Eflux Journal, the first two parts of this massive project trying to think about the infrastructural, political, radical kind of figure of kind of paralysis. It's also this is part of a book I have coming out this fall that includes a lot of this work and is linked to some of the stuff I was talking about today. But one of the things I really argue for in there is that, the question is how you shift away from a kind of demanded or required organic individual flexibility, the one who can bear everything, the one who kind of takes it upon themselves, right? To kind of deal with the kind of impossible structures, stresses, debts of the world, towards something more like an articulated flexibility in which that ability to kind of adapt, react, retool, shift, etc., comes entirely through a process that's like multiple, that's trans-individual, that happens in the ways that people support each other or evade systems of power, etc. So a little bit of, in terms of this question then about, yeah, like self-optimization, etc., people's decisions of how they want to feel in the world aside, again, which I have no interest in like judging on that front or something. But I think what we have to be really wary of is anything that reinforces the individual as the like horizon line of political thought. I think that is at the constitutive heart of liberalism. as a project in some regard there. And I think we've seen the absolute like ravages and failures of that as a kind of mode of thinking. And, and again, I get at this in the essay on sabotage and stuff as well, that also historically cuts from possibility an enormous range of techniques, tactics, and ways of thinking about forms of refusal and resistance, especially the ones most needed by people with the least power. So that would be a little bit of that. Did I hit? Oh yeah, and the thing about the grass, I was gonna say, just I alluded to this already, but like I do think that maybe it's less a question about like unplugging and going back to trees, although you can see I live in tree land and I enjoy being in these spaces, but so much as like transporting also to built spaces, to platforms as well, to software, etc. The same kind of noticing that maybe we tend to historically associate with something like the function of the landscape, right? And I think, there's a pastoral trap. I think the trap of pastoralism is that I feel like you and I've talked about this forever ago, but like, the pastoral has to sever the possibility of interaction and use in order to produce something as contemplative or to open the prospect of that. So that, that's not the model, I think, per se, but maybe the question is less about like unplugging and going to grass so much as trying to think about shared techniques of avoiding automaticness, right? And thinking about, and it takes really forced things. It does take, like, I turn my router off. And I can't be trusted with turning the Wi-Fi off my computer. I need to like go unplug, like I gotta knock the power grid out. So I think these things have such deep barbs in all of us, me extremely included, that it does take melodrama in the same way that like it takes a riot to achieve extremely liberal political goals. So, I think one should never be surprised by the severity of means needed to achieve what seem like things we should reasonably be able to do ourselves. But I also, take seriously how, and I talk about this in that essay you mentioned as well, how unknowable we often are to ourselves. And perhaps one is better to think about like patterns and predictable behaviors rather than convincing myself to do something better than what I currently do, because that doesn't seem to work very well, Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. I feel like probably the rest of the panelists have some questions, and Maddie, I don't know if there's any from the audience too.
Yes, I'm not seeing any there yet, so please, residents, unmute and join in.
Hi, Evan.
Hey, how are
Thank
you?
you so much for such inspiring talk. So I'm gonna ask her probably very broad questions because uh, would you say that architecture has much bigger, or let's say a different kind of capacity compared to art to kind of untangle the historicized moment that we're like a social, political, environmental issues kind of intertwined, like the moment that you're trying to identify. Because a lot of times, I think if we put art and architecture together, I think meaning we recognize their ability to reveal and identify this kind of issue almost like a biological slice of certain moments or over time. For instance, probably one of my favorite film director, Michelangelo Antonioni, like his film, I think pretty much, let's say, make a slice of the time and modernity that is suddenly captured at maybe certain moment in last century Italy, and he also gives, as an artist, that he also gives kind of metaphorical critique. But do you think architects can give different forms of critique or maybe respond or untackle this kind of issues? I'm asking this because a lot of time we think, or maybe art is more personal, maybe sometimes more idiosyncratic comments of a certain phenomenon. Architecture as a three-dimensional art is associated with the society, social justice. It involves a lot of things. It doesn't mean it necessarily has much bigger power and capacity to respond.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, A partial answer. I'll try to give a full answer, but I want to narrate what I was thinking because I actually think it's relevant for how we tend to talk about art and architecture. And I think when we're together, when Marissa earlier suggested, when I was saying cinema, art, etc., you're like, and architecture, I was realizing I was like, I actually don't know if I'd include that, or like, I think it's interesting. Like I left it out, even though I know I was talking to architects. I was like, I'm not going to say that because I actually maybe think there's something different. So what I was going to say at first, and then I want to qualify this, is, the relation to outlays of huge amounts of money, of kind of capital that architecture, as let's say a practice, built architecture, not necessarily speculative architecture or other practices that kind of largely flee construction. I mentioned someone like Aldo Rossi famously on the, built a little bit, but other than Galleratesi, like pretty much not, right? But I would say that, on the one hand, the ways in which architecture as a practice has to negotiate structures of governance, planning code, huge amounts of financing, etc., means that it just has a different degree of being tangled up in that than art does. But the reason I don't want to hold to that is the main difference is I actually think that would overly romanticize or kind of perpetuate a myth about kind of artistic practice that even the very idea of the autonomy of art has long hinged on, which would be the claim that it somehow is outside of those mechanisms, when in fact I think it's not. So I do think there's a certain question of like, yeah, the amount of coordination, the many-handedness. I think architecture and cinema are maybe ones that I tend to think of as having a really close bond in some interesting ways that has a lot to do with the fact that, yeah, you can have an architect or a star architect or a director, but it is necessary if it comes to be built / filmed / available in the world, the numbers of people involved in the process of that, the number of different technical knowledges, the amounts of capital involved, they really are on a scale that means we have to give up on any lingering fantasy of like the pure auteur or that, you know what I mean? So on the one hand, and this is why they're two of the forms that are most interesting to me historically, is that they are de facto collective, I would say. That's one question. Maybe would have to be we'd want to sort of not a scale, but like a range that goes something from like, yeah, building an entire housing complex over to writing a novel or a poem, which needs comparatively few resources in the world in order to exist and circulate, all the way to something that really does require a lot of time, a lot of people, sometimes a lot of brick or other kind of material, so that would be kind of one version. I think, though, what's fascinating about this question is it has to do, I guess, with like, what are the ways that we comport ourselves or like not pre-prep, but like, what are the kind of experiences we expect to have in front of something that we are thinking of as an artwork or a film, even like Transformers or whatever? We sort of treat this as something like that, as opposed to, let's say, a train station I'm moving through, which may have more of, or in fact, way more kind of careful thought about perception, about how people move through it, etc. But in many ways, we go into it, of course, not unless we're on like an architectural tour or particularly attuned to these, we largely don't move through such spaces with that as a kind of primary comportment or something we're kind of looking for. So that's maybe another kind of interesting difference a little bit. I, of course, think that there's ways of like being in physical spaces, including in architecture and forms of building that encourage this, that are absolutely radical in how they work with inherited typologies, with how they transform what we expect or not, But there's a big question, a little bit of like, I guess what I want to say, and I think this is really true of all forms of what we might think of as cultural practice, architecture included, so much of what happens in the conversations we have around it, rather than in the things themselves. Like I remember years ago, because I was writing about apocalyptic film and kind of doomsday stuff, someone asked me to later write. It was like there was a post-2008 financial crash. There was very, very clearly like, oh, now there's all these disaster movies coming, all these apocalypse movies. Like this must be about that. And I wrote this piece and I ended up arguing and thinking a lot about it, where I was like, well, look, these films were all, and this is the architectural similarity. Like if a building pops up, like if a building gets finished in my town, I'm not going to be like, how does this reflect on the presidential campaign? I'm like, this thing was through planning a decade ago, was built over all of these years. And to imagine that it somehow like crystallizes a social anxiety right away, it would just be totally foolish. And cinema, something similar. Like you can have a film come out and say, oh, it captures the moment. You're like, yeah, maybe, but it was written fully a decade ago. It was greenlit 7 years after that, started going principal photography 5 years ago. Right. Point just being that if we hew to the actual timescale of how things are made, the way in which something is critical, so to speak, is often not really going to be there the way we want it to be. But I think if we think about the labor, the powerful critical labor that architecture, I think, can participate in, that film can, etc., as being an occasion for, yeah, an unsettling, and an unsettling that'll be kind of put back together in how we use a space or how we talk about it, then maybe we start to get a different account of critique. I teach in a context of kind of contemporary art because I'm teaching this curatorial studies program. And if someone was to ask me like what defines contemporary art, which no one should ask me ever, or whatever, people can, but like, above all, it's this generic blanket claim that something is critical. The term's used all the time. For something to count as contemporary art, it must be seen as critical in some regard there. That comes to mean basically nothing in some regard there. But I think a much more powerful version would be saying like critique happens when we start to move again in the world beyond just kind of our, I think like that production of that discorrelating encounter or holding that open is really kind of powerful. The next question is like, okay, where do you go from there? And that's why for me, like, I wouldn't want to say, oh, that film's like a crisis film or that film captured this moment. I want to be like, no, it does what it does and churns along on its own time scale, much like much construction does in the world. But the ways we then occupy it, argue with it, hate it, champion it, etc., that's where this other stuff happens. So I don't know if that gets to your, if that answers your question, but I think that's how I'd start to think about that,
Yeah, perfectly. I think in some of the ways, I think architecture, as you mentioned, is something compared to art. I think art is in many ways more, maybe not that instant, but more immediate, immediate response to a certain moment. Architecture as like form is something that is crystallized, is certain things that has been captured by the artist and crystallized, and then it's something that is congealed within the spatial network, which I think is. Yeah, go ahead.
No, finish the thought. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. You're saying within the spatial network, and then you're going to say the.
No, I'm just saying architecture compared to art is something that is congealing within the spatial network.
Yeah. Absolutely. And the reason I mentioned around analogy and passing the talk was, I wanted to come back to this if we did, with someone like Aldo Rossi, who has been important to me, part of the thing that's interesting, and you get this in Scientific Autobiography, which is a wild book. It's a kind of a fascinating read. It's like pseudo memoir. But he, rather than referring to analogy as just a sort of structure of what Foucault talks about as one of the four orders of similitude in a kind of classical period, that crucially allows us to think relation that can transpose. But for Rossi, there's something interesting else that happens that leads to this kind of figure of an analogical architecture, which is it's this kind of like strange, they are within spatial networks, but for him, they're not only always lived, they're also always memorial. They're always opening to kind of memories. And he has this incredible, I'm going to get the passage wrong, so excuse me for like butchering it, but the kind of figure of it is he's in the Basilica, he's in like this sort of space in Milan, I believe, watching the fog come in and kind of like, almost the fog that would kind of touch and weather at the wall. And this produces this kind of chain of associations. For him, this analogical set of links, his figure of the lighthouse is always interesting to me because I grew up in Maine, so it is our like vernacular architecture. But, for him, what's so key is like, yeah, there are these, indeed, it's embedded within a spatial network, but it's also embedded within we could say an analogical or typological network that is not just purely formal. It's not like, oh yeah, that's a reference to X. It's like, no, I'm in there, and the way in which I see the wearing down of that wall in this particular place conjures for me or opens up or activates these memories of kind of other spaces, right? And for him, this also, like, in a fascinating way, like drifts in and out of time. He has this whole account of sort of almost like you look at the city and you imagine what it'll look like when it's been entirely taken over again by the ocean and by sand. This is when the holiday is over, right? So in any case, just to say, yeah, I think the way you're identifying this divide, I think, is really spot on. And I think maybe where some of it gets interesting is if we also think about, architecture as involved in relatively involuntary memory processes or structures of association and different histories of use. I mean, that's the other point that someone, not exclusively, but someone like Rossi would make, is like, these things become monuments not because they're built as a monument, because they're lived and they're used and they're weathered. I think I've written in the past and thought a lot about like the tearing down of statues, particularly of like white supremacist sort of statues in the US, and I think, of course, the sort of conservative version is like, we know you don't like this history, but it's important. I mean, I don't know why I'm doing a fake conservative voice, but this like awful argument as if like, yes, it's a stain on our past, but we must have the memorial to remember it. This is obviously totally cynical reasoning, but it also gets wrong the fact that in tearing that down, the video of that, the images made of that, animates and charges that space and makes of it like a counter memorial or counter monument infinitely more powerful than what was there. So maybe this is also, I think, towards Marissa's point, or that you were starting to, I think, to around like the technical and like it sounds like the technical versus smelling the grass, whatever. But just to say that, like, I also would want to have the same thing about physical space, like architecture maybe as it's physically, touchable, built in some regard, as opposed to also how it lives and is altered and animated within, let's say, other forms of media, right? Like its primary medium is spatial, but it also is not reducible to that. So yeah, and within film criticism, I could go on this. There's a whole interesting version of trying to think this via like Raymond Durgnat and others, but I would just say that one of the ways maybe that architecture exceeds the spatial network that it is stabilized within, that it must negotiate in order to be constructed in the first place. It also belongs to, I think, these other networks that often can be quite thickly involved in cultural imaginaries, and that kind of lives in many different kind of media forms.
We got a question that maybe relates to the
Oh, cool.
statues a little bit. How do you think the concept of the irrevocable past shapes contemporary approaches to the preservation of historical sites and the narratives embedded within them? Additionally, how does this connect to our potential loss of ability to notice correlations between the past and future? Can we really preserve something we haven't lived or noticed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me think on this one. Let me reread it again and think, because it's a good double question here. How do you think the concept of the irrevocable past shapes contemporary approaches, historical sites, and the narratives embedded within them? I wish I had this person in here because I want to ask them a follow-up question. Just to clarify here, potential loss the ability to notice correlated. Yeah, let me. Oh, now I lost it. Answered. I definitely did not answer that. Let me go backwards from this. I mean, can we really preserve something we haven't lived or noticed? Yeah, I think what's interesting in all of this, and maybe this really aligns, you're pushing me to an interesting direction. Maybe this aligns a little bit with what I was getting at with the very figure of correlation as opposed to like co-relation or co-realism or something, which is that I think I'm getting at something that's always going to be synthetic and sort of technical or sort of proposed in some regard, rather than something that like this was real and it must be held on to. Like, that's to say, I think there's an interesting question of like, I don't think the past is ever preserved in an and I don't think you're saying this, the past is never preserved in an unqualified, unmediated way, right? It's always historiographically shaped. It's from the very beginning constituted around projections, overlays, fantasies, etc. So I think there's a kind of way in which even like the irrevocable past itself is a kind of it's a trope, or it's not to say it's a fantasy in a good way. I mean this by fantasy, I mean fantasy in the sense of like that which provides or ascribes a certain coherence or totality to what otherwise might not be, right? There's a kind of fantasy of coherence. So I think, yeah, it's complicated because it's like a question of how we also avoid falling into this trap just of something like loss, and I think the example I was giving of the kind of Fireflies essay and something like this here, one way that works would be something like pure nostalgia, like a sort of a lapsarian fall. Like we once had this, we were in this plenitude, we did not notice when it was happening, now it is gone. I'm wary of that. Not, I think there's real instances of that, and they are mournful and we should take really seriously. But I think that the much more generative way to think about something like that is often to think about things that have changed form or sort of mutated or been subsumed in other ways, rather than or you'd say they get kind of like produced as a kind of fiction in maybe in a generative way in some regard, rather than some kind of pure continuity of the past. This maybe also has to do with what I was saying about the example of like conversation or dialogue that happens after something rather than in the thing itself. That like the very attempt to try to hold on to an irrevocable past or to let it go, I think is often kind of more powerful than some kind of quiddity or like thing itself or some kind of durable trace of that would give us that contact with the past in some regard there. So yeah, yeah, it's a fascinating question. I want to think more about it. And know more what, if you're still on here, you can say again what exactly you're thinking of with the kind of irrevocable past in here. But I think I would want to like start to approach it, yeah, through this particular emphasis on sort of correlations being a kind of wager that might be kind of borne out, and discorrelation again being something again that's not necessarily even that like, oh, a link has been broken or sort of something has been lost, so much as that kind of sick in the gut, like heart sinking feeling, or just some like kind of unsteady ground, first order of kind of noticing that what once kind of maintained no longer is, or has become kind of destabilized. The last thing I'll sort of say on this is I think, an important word for me is the kind of category of articulation, or the articulated, particularly from people like Stuart Hall, the key thinker in kind of cultural studies, is really important. And I think it's actually really important, I would also say, in like thinking about histories of technology and techniques and architecture, because the articulated for Hall suggests that which may be able to function as a seeming kind of unity or as a kind of single entity, but in some sense has no organic unity or bond to it, right? The articulated name in his account, articulation names the process by which potentially discrete, independent phenomena, forces, tendencies kind of coordinate or are coordinated and can produce in some sense that which looks to be transhistorical, permanent, etc. But crucially, we need to kind of insist that it's not. And that has this way of both, that has a really important stakes for thinking ideologically. How do we refuse the supposedly natural? How do you keep kind of like doing the work of being like, this conception of, let's say, kind of race or nation, etc., is not a given. There's no like grounding in the actual organization of the world. What there are certain articulations that try to build buttresses to hold them up. Like law is not real, cops prop up the fiction of law in some regard there. It's not grounded in any sort of sense of the naturalness of property. Conversely, articulation also lets you think about, maybe this is back to Marissa's question also about the individual or the kind of self-optimization, self-help version. Articulation would be a way of also thinking about how do you coordinate those that might not, like something that was never a single thing or isn't a natural entity or a natural unity, but can be kind of articulated into something that has more force than it would otherwise. So that's maybe a kind of another term for there. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk more with you about the irrevocable past question and know what else you're thinking about with it.
I was thinking about the difficulty of for actually working on something that is absent that I
Yeah.
haven't noticed because of the time of the problem that is created and the time that
Yeah.
I take in my hands. So I was thinking about the example with the fireflies,
Mm.
and that it worked perfectly like the solving an algebra problem actually the totals, because starting with a problem, we usually, as I remember actually from my younger years, we said what if. So we start with thinking that we already have the solution. So
Yeah.
what if we don't? And at the same or in another version, we say what if we have it. So I just thought that it was really clever as a method, to be used historically.
Mhm.
Maybe, I don't know. Yes, and I was thinking, could it work as a method to say what if it does not exist, or if it does exist?
Yeah. This is a really, really fascinating question, because I think that, on the one hand, one of the things you could say, that the one version of the what if you're getting at, we could put under the sign of something like speculation, a kind of work of there'd be the question of like, what do speculations about possibilities produce in the present? What do they really produce? So this is a kind it's a question whose stakes are really huge. And I think, I'll maybe link it back to the example around, let's say, kind of climate I was raising, or indeed even, in a way that's maybe different, because I raised the figure of the history of nuclear weapons, and the kind of, the histories of something like that. The primary cultural tactic, you'd say, especially around like atomic weapons, that people tended to use, was a kind of what if question raised to the nth degree. This kind of, and Gunther Anders, who was a really interesting philosopher and anti-nuclear activist, etc., he took this very seriously. He referred to these as just like warning images. And he kind of wrote, he was a very interesting novelist, but would kind of also write these sort of parables. They were a little kind of too obvious, but like about, nuclear doomsday, for instance, in some regard. The question becomes like, to what degree are what ifs of that variety as effective as we want them to be? I think this is a hard question, and it's one that like I've actually thought a lot about in the context, especially of the ways in which not let's say not a what if of like, let's say an image or like a photograph is made, like not a fake one, not like, or not fake, let's say not a digital image, not like, oh, I went into a computer or graphics program and I've made an image of the Amazon entirely burned, right? But a different kind of what if image that circulates. And these are the video, but especially the photos that circulate the world over, of actually ongoing forms, let's say, of ecological devastation, right? Like the fires in the Amazon, for instance, or like in Houston many years ago when like it flooded through the second story windows. We know what these images look like, right? And the thing that's interesting is they often are posed under the sign of like, yeah, this is a moment in the present, but this is a kind of image of what is to come. This is often how they're kind of talked about. Where things get really tricky, and why I've over the years, whatever, why I think I've started to have a certain doubt about some of this, maybe especially when it comes to visual imagery rather than other forms, is I think it discounts the way in which images like that really participate in a different kind of experience, which is not so much one of horror or shock or, oh my God, this will happen, but a certain, to be honest, visual pleasure, or sort of frisson or something. Like the images that get circulated of the fires in the Amazon are the most striking and quote unquote beautiful images. Those are the ones that like ricochet around Instagram or on news media, etc. I did a long study of this and found like not only are they relentlessly similar, I mean, this would be a whole other talk, but like I can show you like there's like a few like typeset forms in which these images are that people expect them to look like and circulate. They come out of apocalyptic like movies and stuff. They drift into photojournalism. People kind of imitate this style. But just to say, like, one of the most preponderant forms of what ifs that gets mobilized in the world has a pretty complicated, messy relationship to people also finding them sublime and or beautiful and or striking. So this is a tricky question. Like, to what degree does, if I contemplate, if I what if and really think through the hell that is produced by some of these things, what effect does that kind of have in the present? And it's one that I think there are moments that have been really powerful with that. I think my wariness right now increasingly has to do with the specific media forms and networks of circulation within which that kind of what if circulates. So that's one thing. However, like, there's a different kind of thing that's less the stark, like, not like what if the end, but something that has much more to do maybe with holding to, I think what you were also picking up what I was saying, this kind of a sort of synthetic sort of imagination, or also something that like holds possibilities open in some regard there. And this is maybe where, like, correlation can get interesting in this way, and without going in the conspiracy theory thing, because one of the things we know is that so much of what we deal with in the world and try to figure out, the actual causes behind them are extremely difficult to discern, often because it's not like a single thing, but patterns, I include here like social and political ones, etc. We deal with these epiphenomena, and it's really tricky to find the kind of, grounding cause or sort of structure beneath them, right? It's one thing to say this is a symptom of something. It's really necessarily hard to figure out where that comes from. There's a side of that that could be right, kind of despairing. And as I've argued, like, that historically has allowed a lot of, I think, particularly state organizations, but also corporations, to dodge responsibility by being like, yeah, it could be this, but it also could be that. But there's another interesting way where, you get this concept or idea or term in sort of critical theory, kind of theory orbit, that people used to talk about a lot, kind of faded a little bit, but this sort of notion of the constellation as a method. And what's kind of relevant for talking about, even though I got really sick of the term, it's been enough years, I'm like, okay, constellations are useful again, because what you get in that figure is maybe similar to what I was saying about articulation, where, it's a way of saying this is a diagram of possibility. These things might be deeply linked, but these being linked in this way doesn't mean, for instance, that any of these other points is totally exhausted by this, right? In the kind of weird, almost literal version, if I look at the sky and I like, whatever, identify a constellation, I'm not like, well, that star's done, because that's only at the Lion, right? There's a way in which what it means is this kind of diagrammatic imaginary that's able to, the example I always like from the definition of diagram that Gilles Deleuze gives, where he talks about it as a map of the relation of forces. And I think there's something to be said about a kind of what if that is recombinatory, that's kind of modular, that sort of takes, again, not the what if of like, what if all this ends? That's a kind of stymieing often, it's hard, that's often more stultifying, than it is kind of animating. But I think a sort of proliferation of what ifs that sort of seek for possible connections, and hold these things open, that maybe is I think a kind of more powerful form, if that gets towards what you're asking. It's an interesting, I'm gonna think on it, or we can talk about it more still, but like yeah, it's fascinating.
It's interesting to me how the conversation about correlations triggers this almost mathematical parallels, right? It's in algebra, or the what if question, or group theory, or other elements that start, discussing links or way to create or break links, which is very interesting what you're bringing to the conversation today, because I think you're really talking about, what I understand as the way you framed the role of a creative, be it an architect or an artist, or maybe a poet, as a twofold. On one hand, a very kind of need a necessity for very deep observation
Yeah.
and seeking out patterns and seeking out relations, and at the same time try to break what are given a set of relations and maintain openness and not fixate on that. And so it's kind of a double sword of willingly defamiliarizing, you said, disassociating or forgetting. That would you agree with that approach?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I, one of the reasons I find architecture really fascinating, both historically and as a practice and as a field of thinking, although I don't want to, not as like a discipline, but let's say like a kind of orbit of thinking is, more, yeah, it's funny, like we were not into like the whatever the muse is, like not amongst the arts, but like let's say like architecture has, I think often historically has an honesty, and maybe this is externally imposed by just the fact that not all, but most buildings that are constructed are also expected to do certain things and to be somewhat functional, like to a certain degree. One of the things that I think that's really generative about this is that it means that architecture has to grapple with inherited forms, with kind of types, with things that you can only bend so far before they just simply don't work. And that to me is not a limit on it. Like I'm someone who most of my interest, all, not all, but like a lot of within histories of literature and film, especially, and video games and everything else, like I'm really interested in practices that openly acknowledge the way in which they are moving within a set of like already given forms, already given imaginaries, already given types. I don't see that at all as like a limit. I actually think that that's like a generative point of beginning because, towards the example I was giving, it's like if we want to think about the work of, you know, unsettling something or kind of, yeah, like even, maybe I'm now thinking of something like decorrelation is almost like a practice, also trying to like decorrelate kind of given things. It has to begin with a reckoning with already given expectations. You have to have a deep understanding of what is familiar, what is expected in order to be able to introduce that kind of wobble. I think the fantasy of in literature for like being without genre or something like that is bullshit. Like all works of literature are genre works. It's just that some of them belong to a genre that pretends to be genreless. And that's like the flat category of literary fiction, which is just a way of disavowing the degree to which, you are moving amongst techniques, types, and forms that precede you. And again, I've never thought of that somehow as like a limit. I think that repetition and difference internal to repetition can be generative of really startling effects in ways that maybe don't visibly take the form of what dramatically claims novelty, but I think actually more often than not is able to produce this like sense of the ground becoming sand under you or something like that. So yeah, I think maybe that's where architecture is especially interesting, is this balancing of, and like infrastructural demands, et cetera. I've written in the past some about and remain really interested in, the thermal demands of architecture, whether this is trying to like ward off or make use of solar gain or kind of like HVAC system. Like, these are also really different things that have to be negotiated, whose stakes again are really high, and it's also, I think there's this, I mentioned Viktor Shklovsky, and he has this sort of, there's this interesting point that happens where he's, the theorist of one of many, but maybe the key theorist of defamiliarization and estrangement. And he sort of makes this point when he's like in exile in Germany, really lonely, really like in love with a woman who doesn't love him back, etc. And he's in a zoo, like looking at the animals, feeling real lonely. And he's kind of like, yeah, defamiliarization is great in art, and it fucking, sorry, he's like, and it sucks in life. Like, so all to say, there's something like, interesting maybe architecturally, where there's a question of like, yeah, there are forms that I think, where it's so potent to like work within this kind of troubling of the given, etc. But there's also something where I'm like, I don't want my heating system to be constantly like making me aware of its precarity and failure. Like I'm well aware of that already. It needs to function. So this is, that's an interesting balance. Again, I don't see that as a block on creativity. It's just an honesty about the demands within which any human practice, has to kind of function. There's this figure who was really important for me was this sort of archaeologist and anthropological thinker named Andre Lewa-Gorhan, who's really important for people like Stiegler. And Lewa-Gorhan really, thinks a lot about transgenerational memory, like memory across generations. And he suggests that, one of the things that's particular about humans as animals is for the most part, we have exteriorized our kind of specialization rather than having hands that are really good at hammering. Like we're not very well-built creatures for a lot of the tasks we might want to do. But what we do is in his phrases, we like exteriorize our memory. We take the kind of memory that might otherwise be genetic or that might be like specialized into like a foot that's really good at slashing. And instead what we do is we build a world, including literally, spatially, we build a world in which these techniques are repeatable and crystallized and stabilized and also don't rely upon parental, either familial or genetic memory to kind of pass that on. So I think there's there's a sort of interesting question for me about the way in which also even forms we take of as purely functional, so to speak, they're also signifying. They also, they not only have these kind of histories, they also are symbolic forms in certain ways. So yeah, I go on this way too long. I'll stop on this, but just to say, I think, architecture is a really, I find it a really kind of tricky, rich, genuinely critical field to think about it, not in spite of the limits it has, of the way in which it has to be bound up with planning and code and HVAC systems and where you put your septic. I live in the woods, so you can tell septic tank's the bigger issue here, but like, it's not in spite of that stuff. I think it's the way in which that, those things, and in Randall Banham's account of talking about like literally like HVAC systems, he says like the key point is how to not merely survive but flourish. I think that remains a really compelling kind of demand. And I think that, yeah, for me, maybe this is, back to your question at the beginning, about architecture and art in some regard there, I think, taking these seriously as both signifying practices as opposed to just infrastructural ones, but also something that's like creative insofar it is enmeshed within what it must repeat. That, for me at least, has given a kind of different way to think about what I find like also defamiliarizing and also unsettling and also powerful within architectural forms or spaces.
There is one more question in the chat. Evan, can you read it?
Let me see. Okay, here we go. Oh, good. It's a follow-up from this here. There we go. Thanks. Okay. Where I was coming from with I'll read it. Can other people? I'll read it out loud so we have it on the thing.
Yes, please.
Okay, so where I was coming from with the irrevocable past, and thanks for answering this again, that humans often project present-day perspectives onto historical sites, believing we can accurately interpret them. Historic preservation is layered with contemporary thoughts, and despite our efforts to comprehend and hold on to ancient sites, it seems we may not truly grasp or retain their essence. Is this perceived loss truly significant if the past was never fully ours to begin with? Is correlating the past with this present voidless? That's interesting. Yeah, this is maybe, I want to maybe put this a little bit in the orbit of the question also that Christina asked about the kind of what if to a certain degree, because I think that, it feels like there's a not impossible, difficult, but maybe necessary, like kind of third position. And this would be something that that neither entirely dominates something with a kind of present perspective, they can't fathom a different like organization of human life or a different kind of form of being in some regard, but nor that holds on to the idea of a kind of unmediated, authentic recovery of something like that irrevocable past, right? In some regard, because I agree, it's always going to be kind of layered with something like that. But I wonder, this sounds kind of strange to say, but I'm like, our perception of, our comprehension of even the moments we are in, you would say, are overlaid and overdetermined by ideological structures and our kind of ways of thinking. That's to say, like, even in the present, we don't have a kind of access to something in its essence in some regard there. I mean, we could argue about this, but I would suggest that like we are organized as animals in such a way, although this interestingly gets back to the correlationism question, but like in Measu, but like, I think we're organized in such a way that like even that which seems to us a direct presentation of something is always going to be suffused with an overlay, with a filling in, with a kind of projection that kind of takes shards, takes fragments, etc., and kind of tries to orchestrate them into something like a narrative or something like a kind of image of a kind of coherent whole in that regard. So, yeah, I mean, I think, an attempt to think the alienness of humans to ourselves at other moments is vital, to really try to like think through that. What would it be to have I'm enough of like a materialist to take really seriously that, for instance, the idea of like property exchange, like that's not overlaid onto some stable basis of human cognition. That fundamentally changes the stakes of that. Alfred Zonrettel kind of makes this point really interestingly, where he's like, yeah, like accumulation and excess and exchange anticipates, precedes, and largely generates the abstractions on which they seem to rely. I think that kind of dynamic is true. So all to say, I do think like there's of course a significant law. Anytime we lose the ability to think the kind of manifold and radically different contours of human experience, that's a genuine loss. Like absolute, that's a major loss. This is why people holding on to languages that are at risk of vanishing is hugely important. This is why I do think forms of like, maybe it doesn't always mean it's spatial. Maybe there's other, as we know, there's other digital forms of like mapping spaces, etc. Whatever it takes, like, yes, I think practically an attempt to hold to those spaces and to not reduce them to I don't know what, like images of continuity is important. But I would also just want to say maybe my weird flip is like, and this is maybe if I was doing the way longer talk where I wanted to go to kind of next, is that like we also feel that coming undone from the present, like in real time. Like what I was going to kind of get to, and again, maybe if I meet you all in August, we can talk about this then, but like I'm really interested in the category or concept of subsumption, of how it is that particular experiences are kind of subsumed into abstractions and historical tendencies, etc. That's a term that gets a sort of specific use within the history of Marxism, which could be a long sort of debate and thing I can get into. But just to say something that I've been really attuned to and tried to write a lot about, etc., is that question of like, how is it to live through the changing of the basic parameters of being in the world? How do you process that again in real time? And this isn't just about the like noticing the fireflies or not. It's like, I've written a ton about, for instance, the diaries kept and poems written by, for instance, women working in textile factories in the 19th century. And what was so interesting to me about these is like, yeah, a lot of them, they like, talk about there's these power looms, etc., as these almost like demonic, monstrous things in like a full kind of incredible sort of like speculative imaginary, this kind of half-live, semi-animate things. There's an obvious kind of like, flat thing people do, which would either sort of treat this as just colorful language or kind of mixed metaphors or some naive reckoning with something like this. I'm like, no, this to me is a realist understanding of the situation you're in, because what we're talking about is your life and its basic rhythms suddenly coming like really quickly in the space of your lifetime to be organized around a kind of inhuman encounter with assemblages that entirely shift the sense of like what it is to be a human and to work. So we need the resources of the what if to raise the example you're doing there. Like, seeing it as demonic or seeing it as kind of monstrous or impossible, etc. We can say like that's not technically true, but it's affectively and cognitively really true as a reckoning of how it feels to have the particulars of your life drawn into a form that is alien to what you know. So I just wanted to raise that because I think, with this great question you posed and clarified around the irrevocable and a certain sense of the kind of void, I think there's a kind of complicated way where, maybe that opens both ways. And what, we are operating in moments where if we think even in our own lifetimes of the forms of technification and the consequence they have in the most basic ways of moving through the world, of thinking time, of thinking the measurability of the body, all of these things, they cut to the quick or beyond. They cut to the bone. Like they are just like absolutely transforming really basic contours of like how it is to be an organism, a human organism in the world. So I would just maybe want to say that we can, I want to avoid the language of the irrevocable when it is used not by you, but when it is used as a form of nostalgia. We had a plenitude and a wholeness, now we've lost it. Where I think things get interesting is if we understand this sense of kind of like being subsumed into something in which you'd say like, based on our current contours, we can only be something like bereft. We do not have the cognitive capacities, at least at first, to move within the world that we have built for ourselves. There's a fascinating way where we lag in that. And I think that latency is powerful. It's also maybe really dangerous. I'm someone who like, I'm on team originary. Like, I think like techniques and technics precede the thought that seems to like generate them. They kind of organize our structure of kind of time and being. So I would just I'll end on that just to say that I think like maybe we want to make sure it's never a one-way street away from like an ancient thing we held, and we lose this as we kind of move forward. I think there's a kind of loss or bereftness that we kind of walk into as well, or that we like build, we build for that and then don't kind of recognize ourselves within it. That's not always a bad thing. I'm not on team like, let's just go back to the grass. I think that there's a way though where like taking seriously how it is to be made alien to yourself in real time, is something that can't be underestimated, and is maybe pretty constitutive of like, being a subject in the world. So, yeah.
I think that's probably a good place to end. I feel like this has been a really rich conversation and we could keep going. So if anybody has questions or comments for Evan, feel free to share them with me after and I can pass them along. Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if anybody has any last words, but I don't want to take up too much more of everyone's time. So thank you so much, Evan, and everybody for participating. And yeah, we'll be in touch.